With a packed session ahead, please let me introduce our four speakers. We have Robin Dunbar, PhD candidate at Old Dominion University, speaking about policy approaches to marine debris removal. She'll be followed by Dr. Nancy Lauer and Michelle Nolan from Duke University, discussing data-driven efforts to influence local policy. And then finally, we're going to have Abdullah Fofana talking about New York City's efforts to address trash.
So good afternoon, and thank you again for this wonderful conference. Every presentation I've gotten a little tidbit of information. So my name is Robin Dunbar. I'm an Old Dominion University PhD candidate in public administration and policy, on track to graduate this spring, crossing fingers. I'm also the Deputy Director of Education for the nonprofit Elizabeth River Project, working to restore one of the most historical polluted rivers in the Chesapeake Bay. In Virginia, it runs through the four cities of Norfolk, Portsmouth, Chesapeake, and Virginia Beach. So my career has included the fusion of art and science, and today I'm going to kick off this afternoon from an art and science perspective. It's going to be a little bit different than the other presentations. Art and science are both human attempts to comprehend and explain the world around us. This can be extremely important, especially with the dynamic, complex problems that often include multiple outcomes versus one solution. So I'll move rather quickly through this presentation to include a glimpse of art that relates to our current marine debris problem, and then transition to a brief timeline of the United States environmental policy and Virginia legislation. In-depth policy knowledge will follow with my other speakers here beside me. I will end with a summary of my current research that includes building a narrative on the views and policy approaches of marine debris removal from stakeholders from multiple sectors located in the Elizabeth River watershed. And the art of narratives or storytelling helps us to better understand, build trust, discuss ideas, and collaborate. So let's begin with this 1886 painting called The Storm, where you can see a ship mast that has become marine debris being tossed and churned about in a choppy sea. And we can go back further to glimpses of other items that are causing marine debris problems today, such as fish nets, seen here during Egypt's 6th dynasty. And as we know, our marine debris has land and water sources. We know that in Rome, sewers led to the Tiber River over 2,700 years ago. Today, our storm drains lead to our precious bodies of water. And in the 1st century BC, we see the use of fishing poles with line and nets being utilized on the Nile. And on one of the most famous maps, Carta Marina from the 1500s, we see barrels floating amongst sea creatures. And here Claude Monet shows us fishing nets in France that we know today come in many forms. And marine debris also appears in stories. Odysseus tells us in Homer's Odyssey that Zeus thundered and hurled his lightning at the ship, ripped the sides from the keel, and snapped the mast to meet the whirlpool's terror, already speaking of gyres. Other seafaring activities cause marine debris, such as here we see a mast adrift from a famous 1600s battle. And here from storms, we're reminded that ships and sails are torn apart. Then the English master painter William J. Turner gives a nod to shipping activities that can impact the environment, air pollution, for instance, such as heaving coal pictured in this 1800s masterpiece. Closer to home in the Boston Harbor, we see a floating barrel. And here, the famous Belgian painter and military officer, Henri Adolphe, includes his most famous masterpiece, Shipwreck, to include floating debris from a ship. Here, Winslow Homer reminds us of fishing nets. And in the 1900s, the romantic William Waterhouse, a very amazing artist, shows us how debris can be pushed and swept to the shore. Now, although the origin of the word gyre dates back to the 1500s, in 1870, French writer Jules Verne wrote 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. He reportedly mentions the U.S. Naval Commander Matthew Fontaine Maury. He was an oceanographer who collected samples from the depths and charted the world's oceans. In the novel, Commander Fontaine Maury described floating debris and gyres by saying, "If any floating substance be put into a basin and a circular motion be given to the water, all the light substances will be found crowding together near the center of the pool, and the Sargasso Sea is the center of the whirl." Verne also included many shipwrecks and abandoned derelict vessels, such as seen with this engraving that was included in an edition of the model of the merchant ship, the Florida Sunderland. And here, Jackson Pollock gives us his version of the transformed sea with an art titled Sea Change. That was inspired by Shakespeare's poem, The Tempest. That was supposedly inspired by the Virginia's Company sea venture of a shipwreck near Bermuda. Then in the 1800s, we have the invention of plastics, here pictured with examples in a London Science Museum, actually, a London Science Museum, and this was followed by, in the 1900s, Rachel Carson's trilogy about the sea. Before writing Silent Spring, Carson began as an environmental journalist with The Atlantic, as she wrote an essay in 1937 titled Undersea, where she argues that to sense the world of waters, we must shed our human perceptions of length and breadth and time and place and enter vicariously into a universe of all-pervading water. Now, as we transition to environmental policies related to water, it's important to acknowledge that environmental policies were preceded by the conservation movement. So in 1872, President Ulysses S. Grant signed the Yellowstone Act. That established the world's first national park. Over 25 years later, the first statutory environmental law, the Rivers and Harbor Act of 1899, was signed. This is the act that is most relevant to my Elizabeth River research, and the intent of that act was to protect navigation. And while wetland protection was not a direct concern of the legislation, it nevertheless was the first legislation to indirectly also protect wetlands. In 1948 followed the Water Pollution Control Act, and then in 1956, the Federal Water Control Act signed by President Kennedy. But one of the most important moments was when the world got a complete, clear view of the blue planet. This was taken by the Apollo 17 astronauts on their way to the moon December 7th, 1972. Soon after was the rise of the environmental movement, including the formation of NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act. Then came the Clean Water Act of 1972, striving for all surface waters to be fishable and swimmable, and giving the EPA the authority to regulate industrial point sources of pollution and municipal wastewater treatment facilities. Then came the Save Our Seas 2020 Act that requires NOAA to coordinate a marine debris program, and today many stakeholders are working towards strategic plans, such as Virginia's Marine Debris Reduction Plan that you'll hear more about soon. And although policies and laws may be in place, much work still awaits us. For example, Virginia's littering legislation began with a report from 1979. It had limited data that included only 20 sites and 2 miles of roads. The fines were just increased up to $2,500 recently, with the litter increasing during the pandemic. Virginia has also approved legislation on plastic bags, mass balloon releases, and polystyrene, but not all Virginia has adopted these laws. For example, only 8 counties have adopted the plastic bag fees that I know of. There are also many strategies that include goals for clean water and marine debris removal, such as the Mid-Atlantic Marine Debris Action Plan. And rivers, each individual river, also has strategies, such as the Elizabeth River's Watershed Action Plan. And these are needed to address the wicked problem, which is a term coined by Riddle and Weber in the 70s that said wicked problems lack one solution. They're complex, they're difficult to define, and include ever-changing dynamics. And marine debris affects everything. Pictured here is an owl caught in fishing line that was hanging from tree branches near a fishing hole in Hampton Roads, Virginia, where the fishermen would reel out and then the line would get snagged into tree branches. This owl did survive, but it was very expensive, took a lot of manpower and special equipment to reach it. And as we are being innovative and many devices are being piloted, they include nets, skimmers, barriers, traps, GPS devices, and bubbles. These are all great examples of the fusion of art and science. Some require volunteers, like this Netty Jellybot on the left, and some can cost up to $1 million, like Mr. Trash Wheel, a skimmer located in the Baltimore Harbor. Then there's a barrier device seen on the left called the Interceptor. It requires sections of bodies of water, though, to be shut down. This was invented by an 18-year-old in the Netherlands and is now deployed in 5 locations, one in the US being in California. There's also trash chappers, as we learned a lot about today. This one pictured is one that was developed through a team competition at Hampton Roads Sanitation District. It was a competition. It cost $10,000, $30,000 to maintain, and it was inspired by how whales filter with baleen. Now, seen on the left, utilizing GPS devices can be affordable and beneficial in identifying fishing nets, but they require vessels to retrieve the nets, which can be costly. And most challenging is bottom retrieval, seen on the right, that is expensive and requires heavy equipment. And there are additional prototypes, such as the bubble barrier. It was launched in Amsterdam. It was made for rivers and canals. But challenges include water depth, the impact to fish, and the need for manpower to collect the debris. And none of these devices are being utilized in the Elizabeth River that I'm researching, except 2 small sea bins at a museum for education. So Virginia's Elizabeth River, pictured here, is one of the closest rivers to the Atlantic Ocean. It's found at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, and the river is home to the world's largest naval facility, the oldest working shipyard, and a world-class port. And most research about the Elizabeth River has focused on legacy pollution. It includes heavy metals noted as PAHs and PCBs that have settled to the bottom of the river and originated from wood treatment plants that use creosote, an oil-derived product that is rich in PAHs. And to my knowledge, there's no macro debris research that is or has taken place on the Elizabeth River. This includes data on sources, accumulation sites, and impacts. Hence, the narrative of the Elizabeth River macro marine debris is unknown. And research shows there is relevance to better understanding marine debris in industrial ports and rivers, like the Elizabeth River, for economic implications, navigational hazards, to provide policy support, establish multi-sector cooperation, and for management of marine debris. As we know, research shows that river emissions account for millions of metric tons of debris annually, with 80% originating from land and being transported very quickly by rivers. And stakeholder participation is crucial in solving environmental problems, especially wicked ones, such as marine debris. Systemic change is needed, along with ensuring all key stakeholders are informed on the magnitude of the problem and they participate to minimize the risk of policy failure. To assess the views and the policy approaches to macro marine debris removal among stakeholders from multiple sectors, I'm utilizing the narrative policy framework to translate their views to narrative elements that include the setting, characters, plot, and morals, and they result in a cohesive story that references a policy stance for marine debris removal. This is a rather new framework from 2010. It's based on the idea that policy narratives are created by stakeholders to influence public policy and seek a deeper understanding of new knowledge. Policy problems have a beginning, middle, and an end, a transformation, a moral, an action, or a result. The plot can include a storyline of blame, decline, conspiracy, and change, and characters can include heroes, villains, victims, beneficiaries, opponents, and advocates. And the moral is often the solution to the problem. A possible scenario with my research may be that the setting is the Elizabeth River, the villain is the marine debris, and the heroes may be those removing it. And although the narrative policy framework began with a quantitative approach, qualitative approaches can be applied and are encouraged to broaden the research and knowledge. My research includes interviewing 30 stakeholders from multiple sectors or until there's data saturation. The participants represent government, public-private businesses, watermen, academic institutions, residents, and volunteers. I've almost completed all the interviews, and the narrative is developing, although I am early in the analysis. What is emerging is that all the stakeholders are obviously daily seeing floating debris, but the difference is their perspective on the negative impact. So while communities and nonprofits and volunteers may see a negative impact of floating plastics, those navigating the channel see old pilings and aging infrastructure as a higher priority. And some are more focused on debris on the land versus what is already in the river. Now, here we have pictured hard-to-reach place. You might not be able to tell, but it's about 20 feet down. And these are building as part of a narrative of difficult areas to remove the debris from. So this here is an accumulation under a railroad bridge. It has debris that's been dumped, washed up in daily tides, and from serving as a dwelling for homeless. You can't tell, but a hawk had gotten entangled into the bicycle spokes of that bike that's right there, and it did manage to free itself, but the urgency to remove the debris heightened. So we had to collaborate and really pull in a lot of team members to help begin to remove all this debris that's going to take years. And although the food and beverage containers have been a common theme with all stakeholders, so has old pilings and wood. In fact, the river is lined with hundreds and hundreds of these old pilings, and the U.S. Corps of Engineers daily patrols the channel to remove the floating wood, and there's more after rain events, wind, and storms. They've been patrolling the channel since the Rivers and Waters Act from the 1800s. They received funding with congressional approval, and I'll be going on one of their patrols next week to get a better understanding of the debris they are removing daily. So one of the biggest takeaways I would like to share is that only 2 of the stakeholders I've spoken with have said that they actually collect data, but they don't share it outside of their organizations. Also, the interviews have been rich with the qualitative approach, and it was necessary to better understand and develop a baseline knowledge of the marine debris problem in the Elizabeth River. And out of all the stakeholders, only one has mentioned a policy that supports their mission. In addition to this research, I'm also implementing an ethnographic study on the Elizabeth River about the project mentioned earlier today about the 100 abandoned derelict vessels being removed in Hampton Roads. So although I'm developing a narrative on the macro debris floating on the Elizabeth River, I'm also getting to the bottom of what's on the bottom of the river, and that's more to come. So now I'd like to move on to other presenters, and they'll give you more details to dive deeper into environmental policies. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nancy Lauer. I'm a staff scientist with the Duke Environmental Law and Policy Clinic. It is my pleasure today to be able to present to you alongside my colleague Michelle Nolan, who's the co-director of the Environmental Law and Policy Clinic at Duke, on some of the policy work that we have been doing in Durham, North Carolina for the last 5 or 6 years on the topics of marine debris and plastics reduction. The approach that we have taken in our policy work is that the sources of marine debris do not just come from coastal communities, and therefore the reductions and prevention efforts cannot just come from coastal communities if we are going to solve this wicked problem. And so we've really taken the approach that inland cities like Durham, even though they are 130 miles from the coast, they are well connected to the marine environment through, in the case of Durham, the Neuse and the Cape Fear River basins. What we do in Durham is going to affect downstream communities, and it's eventually going to affect the marine environment. I also want to note that we realize North Carolina is not technically part of the Mid-Atlantic, and some of the policy solutions that we have identified in our work and developed in our work are, we believe, widely relevant to other states, but we also think it's important to be here today to highlight the perspective that some of the other states outside the Mid-Atlantic and some of the challenges outside the Mid-Atlantic that we are dealing with when it comes to reducing marine debris and preventing plastics from reaching our waterways. We have some very unique and difficult political and legal landscape challenges that we are working through right now in North Carolina, and those are unique to several, or those are similar to several other states as well, and unfortunately may be undermining sort of the comprehensive work that we're all trying to move forward together. So I'm going to start by talking about some of the data that we've collected. And we've collected this data in an attempt to inform the policy solutions to keep plastics and waste out of our waterways. One of the very first things that we did back in 2017, 2018 was try to get a better picture of what types of waste were ending up in our urban waterways in Durham. And so we went out to 13 different streams shown on this map highlighted in red, and we collected all of the litter that we found in those certain segments, and we categorized that litter into different categories: plastic film, hard plastic, styrofoam, metal, glass, and other. And this is what the data looked like that we had collected. Each one of these bars is a different stream that we went out to and collected litter data on, and each one of those colors represents a different category. And we were really just trying to sort of get that picture of what types of things were escaping into the environment, into our waterways. And what we very quickly found was that plastics made up anywhere from 40 to 90% of the litter that we were finding in our urban creeks, and that every single urban creek that we went to had litter in it, had plastic in it. We continued this data collection work throughout the years, and one of the projects that we are particularly proud of and that has provided a lot of really informative data is our work with the North Carolina Riverkeepers. The North Carolina Riverkeepers received a grant a couple years ago to install trash traps throughout their various watersheds in North Carolina. So they initially installed 15 trash traps throughout the state. They've continued to install them as they find that they are incredibly useful devices, and the volunteer base grows to be able to maintain them. And this is a picture of one of them in particular. The Riverkeepers in North Carolina are largely installing trash trouts, which are a in-stream trap device similar to the Litigita, similar to the Bandalong, that floats on the water and catches those floatables before they move downstream. I can't remember if I said this, it's manufactured by Asheville Greenworks, and so it's also locally made in North Carolina. So we worked with these riverkeepers that when they would go out to maintain these traps and collect that litter, they would also collect data on that litter. And we wanted to collect more granular data this time than we had in our first data collection event in Durham's urban creeks. And we're really looking at sort of what those specific litter items were. We knew plastic was a problem, but we really wanted to look at what those specific plastics were that were making their way into our streams. And so this is a dashboard that's publicly available. You can go to this website and see where the North Carolina Riverkeepers have installed trash traps. You can go to the specific trash trap and see what types of litter and the data that they are collecting for that particular trash trap. So far, there's about 11 trash traps that have data for them out of the 15 or maybe even 16 or 17 at this point trash traps that have been installed throughout the state. So there's been 144 clean-out events so far, and in those clean-out events, these trash traps have shown to be removing about 63,000 litter items. And my big result of the day has already been spoiled, as other people have found this with this trash trap, that these trash traps are collecting an incredible amount of styrofoam. We have found that styrofoam fragments have just been a very pervasive and incredibly problematic pollutant in North Carolina's waterways. So 73% of the litter that we have captured in these trash traps by number are styrofoam fragments. Styrofoam just gets in the environment, it pulverizes, turns into several pieces. It's very buoyant, and so it very effectively moves through the stormwater system and moves downstream and gets captured by these devices. The other major culprits have been plastic bottles and cigarette butts. And I do just want to make the point here that in the litter surveys that we've done sort of on land and just going out to streams, sort of stagnant without the trash traps, but looking at what's captured in the landscape, captured in the sediment, that's where we see a lot more of things like the aluminum cans and the glass bottles and the plastic bags and the food wrappers. The trash traps are really effective at capturing the buoyant litter that moves downstream, But still, these other things like food wrappers, plastic bags, they're absolutely there in the environment in North Carolina, just not necessarily captured by this data. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Michelle Nolan. She's going to talk about some of the policy solutions that we've developed in response to this data that we have been collecting.
Thanks, Nancy. So all of the information that we were collecting was to help us understand better the scope and the characterization of the problem, but also was really designed to help us think about policy interventions and legal tools that local governments could use throughout the state of North Carolina. Our research showed that a lot of government intervention was really designed to be quite reactive. You know, how do you properly manage and dispose of waste, and what do you do when that waste has been mismanaged? And we really wanted to get local governments to think more proactively about preventing the generation of waste to begin with. And so this type of information could be really useful for designing those types of interventions to reduce consumption, reduce waste generation, and then think more of disposal and interventions through the stormwater system as a last resort in trying to manage the problem. So we designed a proposal for the City of Durham. We worked in very close collaboration with our city solid waste management office, our stormwater program, and elected officials. And we did a lot of surveys of local businesses to figure out what they would find palatable, what they would find relatively easy to implement, what concerns they had, and how we might be able to address those concerns. And interestingly, through those surveys, we learned that 95% of local businesses were interested in working with us and finding ways to reduce plastic waste. They recognized that doing so would save them money, as well as better protect the aesthetics and quality of the environment. But the one thing that they wanted was something that was uniform. They didn't want to have to compete in a race to the bottom. They wanted something that would be enforceable against their peer businesses so that those other businesses would not have an economic advantage by socializing the costs of pollution. So with that in mind, we were able to design a policy proposal outlined here that when we originally envisioned this presentation, we were hoping to let you know that it had been adopted and endorsed. This included a bag fee, enforcement of a current statewide ban on polystyrene, bans on plastics for dine-in operations, an opt-in requirement, and a procurement policy for the city itself. Many of the things that other people have talked about here, as well as the skip the stuff ideas that we'll be hearing more about later on today. Unfortunately, however, the Retail Merchants Association had better connections with our state elected leaders through the General Assembly than we did. Not surprising. And 2 days before this policy was going to be voted on by the City of Durham, there was another proposal that was being considered by Buncombe County. We were doing this in tandem. Buncombe County is Asheville up in the mountains of North Carolina. Provision was slipped into the state budget that preempted all local control. This was attached to the state's Medicaid expansion, and so even though the governor was very sensitive to the concerns that we were raising, there was no way that he was going to reject this budget proposal after having worked so long and so hard to try to get Medicaid expansion through the state. So this is the preemption language. It focuses on all units of local government, cities and counties, and it is very broad, and we think creates some interference with other statutory mandates under our Solid Waste Management Act and under our State Water Quality Act. But this is what we have to deal with right now that has thrown huge buckets of cold water on local initiatives. Really interfering with the local government's ability to reduce trash, even though they have the statutory responsibility for managing that trash and managing the mismanagement of trash. So can't charge a tax or a fee, can't prohibit or restrict or otherwise regulate these items if they constitute an auxiliary container, which is very broadly defined in terms of the types of containers, the types of retail establishments, and the types of materials that those containers are made of. So it's very, very problematic, and that has kind of required us to do a radical pivot in our approaches here. We wanted to emphasize that North Carolina's preemption problem is one that is shared throughout the country, and you're in a bit of a unique bubble here in the Mid-Atlantic area. And so as Nancy started the talk by pointing out, rest of this country is dealing with something that looks a lot different in a policy landscape. And so if we're going to actually make a dent as a society in reducing marine debris and the associated problems, we really need to be thinking creatively about supporting those other communities. This is something that is being promoted, the preemption being promoted by the ALEC group, and retail merchants and bottle companies, beverage providers and things like that are really fighting these types of efforts around efforts to control and prevent the generation of trash around the country. So it's something that we really have to pay attention to and provide support to these other communities for. The upstream solutions that are still available, this is something that we really want to emphasize to other communities that are dealing with preemption problems. City and county government procurement remains an option in most of these communities, and so those local elected officials have the opportunity to lead by example. They can also invest in reuse infrastructure. We have some innovative programs in Durham supported by entrepreneurial-oriented nonprofit organizations to have recirculating takeout containers through our Green to Go program, and also recirculating reusable bags that go primarily right now to discount retailers and retailers that are serving low-wealth communities. Another program that started in Australia, Boomerang Bags, that's the concept that is being used here. Education and outreach programs are also very important, and as we've heard from others during the symposium, this needs to go beyond just basic tabling and newsletters. This has to be really embedded in community with a lot of proactive, creative research and support to build relationships, build trust, and design programs that are going to best suit the communities in which those initiatives are located. Voluntary efforts such as the certifications we heard about earlier today with the ocean-friendly establishments. We're actually talking with the North Carolina Surfrider chapter and another organization called the Plastic Ocean Project to try to bring the ocean-friendly establishment protocol and program up to the city of Durham and other inland cities in North Carolina. So that's something that we would really like to see expanded. The main thing that we have left for us is really focused on the stormwater intervention system. I want to just note quickly with the on the left, the little map we have there of a litter survey that we've done, very similar to the trash characterization profiles that Maryland has. All those areas in red are areas that have significant trash burdens on the street, and as we know, those trash burdens go into our surface waters through the stormwater delivery systems. But what we're noticing is that those areas that are more heavily trashed are former redlined areas within our community. Now, as someone else pointed out today, we're not here to suggest neighborhood shaming or anything like that, but rather to invite exploration into the reasons that we're seeing that. What we've been able to tie it to in North Carolina is a difference in waste delivery services. A lot of these communities have roads with higher speed limits. There are more commercial operations, and there is more intense residential development in terms of, high-density apartment buildings, all of which are facilities that our Solid Waste Management Office does not serve. And so these different community businesses and residential structures have to privately contract for recycling and waste management services. And so that creates there an inherent disparity in terms of the policies that are provided. I see that we have already run out of time. I apologize for that. I would be happy to address questions about the water quality standards and narrative criteria enforcement and things like that through the Clean Water Act at the end of this. So thanks for your time.
Initially, I was just going to talk about MS4, and then I modified it a little bit to include CSO and MS4. New York City, where's which one again? Oh, this one. Good. New York City has two types of systems. We have the combined system and the separate storm sewer system. 60% of the system is combined. What that means is sanitary waste. Some part of the storm, they get into a single pipe, go to a treatment plant, and then they're being treated. Remove trash, remove nutrients, remove everything before discharging into the ocean. And then we have the separate system. It rains, direct to the ocean, no treatment. So in New York State, the Department of Environmental Conservation determined that some of our surrounding waters are polluted, like with floatables and other pollutants. So they impose two types of permit for the city. One of them is they call it the CSO permit. CSO, there are a lot of terminologies to water quality. So here, if you see like SPDIS, it means State Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. So they regulate water quality. New York City has 14 wastewater treatment plants. We don't call them that way anymore because we recover like resources from them. Like we take sludge, convert that to energy for electricity and heat. So all our 14, we don't call them wastewater treatment plants, we call them wastewater resource recovery facilities. So we take the resource, remove the sludge, convert it to energy, and then supply the treatment plant, both for heat and electricity. So that there are 14 permits for those ones. I manage the MS4 permit. That one is basically 40% of the city is made up of separate sewer. So that's the program I manage. I don't manage the combined sewer, but I coordinate all these programs together. In addition, I also coordinate other city agencies like sanitation, because it's big in trash or floatables. DOT, city parks, so I coordinate all those ones. And so that's what I'll be talking about briefly as we go along. And then I'll talk about the existing programs that we have to control floatables. There are challenges, we all know. There are challenges when you're trying to control floatable. New York City is 8.5 million people. In addition to that, we have like 1 million people, roughly 1 million people coming there every day to work. So trying to control that is kind of challenging. So I'm going to go through some of the challenges that we face. Then the permits, the SPDIS permits require the city to monitor to make sure that whatever we are doing in terms of floatable controls is working. Again, I said we have two types. One for the combined sewer areas and the other one for the separate sewer system. The requirement for the combined is we have to implement controls to reduce floatables. In addition, we have to monitor to make sure whatever we are doing is working. That's an old one. The CSO has been there for years. The MS4 permit for New York City is new. It started in 2015. The state regulators, they want us to quantify the amount of load coming from those separate sewer systems. They also want us to come up with a methodology to come up with new BMPs, best management practices, on selecting those practices, sizing them, and then later putting them at location that will be strategic so that those floatables don't end up in the receiving water bodies. Our control starts from the land side. We want to avoid the issue of where you have to go in the receiving water body to do the cleanup. We start with awareness, talking to New Yorkers about the dangers of discharging like pollutant in the streets. So we have a lot of posters. We have a lot of signs. And the most interesting part of this is I like when we get the young people involved. I think there's a lot I will talk about. We are moving out. So the younger kids come in, they're going to face this challenge. So we have to walk them through the process. So we have like Talk Trash New York. These are for kids like basketball. When they have like those games, they have like those hoops where they just learn to put the garbage in those garbage cans. And another big challenge we have is like in parks, city parks, people don't pick after their pets. So we have these bags, provide bags and these signs so that they know if you just litter like that, it's going to end up in the water. You will not be able to go swim there or fish there or even have fun there. So we have, I'm not going to go through all of them, it's a lot. So these are some of them that we have to compete to the public, the dangers of discharging on the streets or the houses. We also have stewardship programs wherein New Yorkers can adopt programs, right? And if you see here, I like the one where we have businesses because a lot of the challenges are from businesses. People buy stuff, they just throw it up there. So we encourage businesses to adopt some of these, like this basket, wherein when the basket is say 2/3 full, they can remove it themselves, put it on the side, right? Tie it, put it on the side, and provide like separate liners for them to put in. And the biggest one here is the 311 call. Every citizen in New York can take a phone, call 311, somebody will respond. Let's say they see a problem somewhere. You can call 311, and the city will respond to go clean up that area. You can adopt a highway. You can adopt blue belts. Blue belts are like wetlands, but wetland and parks mix. So you can adopt like beach cleanup. We have a single-use plastic ban. Before the ban came into effect, we did like a pilot where we talked to businesses, like 9 retailers, gave them like reusable bags and also posters to give to communities. Like when they come to do shopping, they talk to the people doing the shopping not to use like single bags or to put more stuff in a bag and don't double those bags because all these ones end up in water. So we encourage businesses to talk to them. Like 9 volunteers, businesses, they took over this pilot, and according to the study we did, it reduced the plastics like by 5%, not much, but 5%. But now we have a full ban, but this was before the ban. I'm not going to go through this because of time. These are all programs to educate the public about not littering in the streets. And the one I like here, again, that's about the school sustainability, wherein we train school coordinators, sustainability coordinators, and then the teachers train the student. And we have the Arts Resource Annual Arts and Poetry Competition. This, again, for young people, K through 12th grade, about they compute, like they go do drawing, poetry, and then they win awards. So, and they have the environmental education program, again, for kids. We take them to receiving water, tell them the dangers, like where the trash goes and how this affects marine life. We also have regulatory measures in place, lots of bans and prohibitions. Bans for littering, we have styrofoam bans, single-use plastic ban, and every business you have to clean up, not only your property, 18 inches into the streets, you have to clean that up. And that's where most of the trash settles, like the 18 inches to the curb, so you have to clean that up. We have patrol teams going around. If they don't do that, they get fines. Now we're moving away from the campaign to kind of non-structural BMPs, we call them. And New York City is huge. We have roughly 24,000 public litter basket wherein you can put your stuff. If you need a basket at a location, you can call 311, we can move basket there. And we're in the process of changing all our litter baskets. People complain about the old one, rats, garbage overflowing. So in 2019, we had a competition wherein we asked New Yorkers to design a kind of litter basket that is welcoming to people. So one of the design we took, the person won like $40,000. You can see from the bottom, I don't have a pointer here, but one of the winners had a basket that is lightweight. You can move it around, it's recycled. You don't have to put a liner, you can just remove it, turn it to the truck, and then put it back. We have about 400 trucks that sweeps around the city of New York. Every day they sweep around 1,600 miles of roadway. According to studies we conducted, sweeping alone reduces trash by 55%. We also have a system wherein city workers go around and rate the streets in terms of litter. And for the most part, for the past couple of years, the streets have been passed, they have a high passing mark in terms of cleanliness. And now we're moving towards, again, we're starting from educating the public to non-structural BMP. Now we're moving slowly to BMPs. New York City, almost all the catch basins where the flow leaves to enter the sewer system, they have hoods. So basically, those hoods, according to studies, if a catch basin without the hood and the hood, you have a 3-inch difference in terms of floatable control. So all of our systems, catch basins that are supposed to have hood are hooded. Hooding alone will not work if you don't have maintenance. Maintenance is key for the effectiveness of hoods. So we have city workers, a minimum, they visit every of the 150,000 catch basins we have, they visit them like once every 3 years. And if there is a debris settled there, they remove it. I mentioned earlier we have two systems, the combined sewer and then the storm sewer area. Combined sewer, when the system is overloaded, you have more rainfall, the treatment plant will not be able to treat all of it. Some of it will escape. So it overflows to the ocean without treatment. Then the state said, no, we have to find a way to control that. So we have been changing. We have been modifying our system. Now we have these retention facilities which can retain water for 50 million gallons of rainfall. They can retain that until when the storm reduces, and then they send back this retained storm water to the treatment plant. And this one I'm showing you as Newtown Creek. That facility alone has a capacity, sorry, not Newtown Creek. This is I'm so sorry, I missed this one. This is about the treatment plant I mentioned earlier. So they remove on average 3 million gallons of cubic yards of residual or waste every year. This one I was talking about. This one, again, is just like a side treatment, wherein these facilities retain water until the storm is gone, and then they push it back to the treatment plant. That particular retention facility alone has a capacity of 50 million gallons. So when the rain is over, the treatment plant, there's no more pressure on the treatment plant, then this system will release water back to the treatment plant for them to be treated. This is the last line of defense we have in New York City. We have 23 containment facilities, either booms or nets. And some of you can see their locations, and these are examples of booms and nets. We have 3 skimmer boats. So basically, these booms and nets, they retain these floatables. And then these skimmer boats, they move to those locations to extract all the waste. They go there between 1 and 2 days when it rains, and they go there every week when it's not raining. On their way to the treatment plants, whatever trash they see on the way, they pick up. I mentioned earlier we have challenges, and these are some of the challenges. Some of the floatables coming to New York City, yes, we are blamed for it, but it's not coming from our jurisdiction. It's coming from upstate. It's coming from the Port Authority of New York. We don't have control over the JFK, for example. We cannot control them. They are not under the city's permit requirement. They're like they call them individual permits. We cannot do anything about it. People still litter. That's where human beings. It's hard to control. With all this education, people still litter. People can even open manholes and dump stuff there, as you can see in one of the pictures. It's just hard to control. Some of them is coming from outside of New York, marine debris, boats, ships. New York is very busy. They just dump stuff in the sea. And we have a lot of marine activities in New York City. Some of them, they move these booms, they move them from their location, so the trash will just come over from the booms into the waters. During Sunday, we have a situation where one of the bridge collapsed, so the vessel we have is not able to go in and collect the floatables from the location. We have 2 monitoring programs, like I mentioned earlier, one for the combined sewer and the other one for the separate storm sewer system. One you're seeing in the picture, we have 58 stations in 2022. This is a simple approach. We go in, we look for the presence and absence of floatables. Basically, you look for presence of or absence of floatables at 3 locations, near the shoreline and also in the open water body. We rate them to very good, then you get like 1, there's no floatables, to very poor, wherein we get that number 5, which means there's a lot of floatables and in a very dense condition. We rank them every year. We look for the 3 worst locations, and then we try to track the source. Why is it happening in this area? And also, what kind of preventions we have in that watershed. And then we go back and see whether we can make changes to improve those controlled measures. And then we have the MS4. Like I said earlier here, this is new to New York. The state wants us to estimate the amount of load coming from the MS4 areas. This is a work in progress. We selected 63 stations, catch basins to do the monitoring. This is out of 34,000 catch basins. We cannot do all of them. It's just an expensive process. But the good news is there are statistics. We're going to use this 64 to extend that to all the 34,000 catch basins. They use what they call multivariate statistical analysis. I'm not a statistician, but that's what they're using to come up with this. We did the measurement for 7 months, and the metrics based on count, weight, surface area, and volume. The load is calculated on an annual basis. Sample collected weekly. We collected 1,940 samples. This preliminary, again, this data results will stay here. We're still working on it. We've not published it. We still have up to 2027 to finalize our report. But again, plastic is showing up a lot. So plastic is number 1, both in volume, weight, surface area, everything plastic is dominating. Of course, followed by papers, but it's plastic again. The load, according to this study we did, is roughly 590,000 cubic yards per year, coming from the MS4 only, not the whole city, just MS4. If you compare that, what does this mean? This is like 21 garbage trucks, regular garbage trucks. But the good news is more than half of this has been captured by our booms and nets. So our guess is the state is going to ask us to do something for the remainder, 8 or 9 garbage trucks. So we are getting there very close. The next step will be to cite those for the MS4 area to come up with a methodology to be able to control the remaining floatables.
We are from Baltimore, And similar to New York, I'm sure we have very similar issues with our sewer system. It's more than 100-year-old system, and the state and city recently came together to contribute hundreds of millions of dollars to fix one small problem on it. And there's so much resources and times that go into fixing one small problem. Are there any resources out there to really help to mobilize residents to push their city and state to do more on updating outdated infrastructure?
We have the same challenge, and no, it's very difficult, because one way we can do that is to raise taxes. They don't like it. People don't want to pay for it. So that's the challenge. We don't get funding from, say, for the federal government. We are a utility company. Utility agency. We have to raise money for ourselves, like water supply, right, and the treatment. And that's what we used to do all these programs. And the only way we can do that is to maybe increase taxes, but that's a huge challenge in New York City.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, coming from Richmond, same story. And yeah, the city actually did kind of an analysis of what it would cost to get to the level, and they looked at what that would mean in terms of raising taxes, and it quickly got out of what certain parts of the communities could actually afford with their annual incomes. So it's a wicked problem. Any other questions?
Yeah, I was going to chime in on that question, actually. So DC Water got sued, and they lost. So they didn't lose, but they settled, and that's why we got a big tunnel. The Anacostia River tunnels just finished delivering this year. It's like a $1.8 billion project, funded partly by ratepayers, but also through bonds. DC Water was very creative in the funding mechanisms they used. We're talking to the respective water keepers, Riverkeeper and James Riverkeeper. You probably have a riverkeeper near you, especially in this region. And if your agencies need political cover or help, you can always sue them, or at least get that discussion going, because it creates an imperative that wasn't there beforehand. You can also look at TMDLs, either through the state or EPA. That helps get a lot of things done too. I wanted to note that the tunnels in DC have become our single largest trash trap. So this fix to the combined sewer overflows, DC was putting 2.5 billion gallons of sewage into the river a year. Just our river we're 2-story tall. I think it's right now 12 or 13 mile long tunnels. So $1.8 billion to solve that and get them compliant with the Clean Water Act. It is also capturing 16 square miles of storm drains. And it has become the single largest trash capture device in the city and probably in the region if somebody does the math. But it can have a lot of benefits besides just the sewage benefits.
Just on the topic that you raised of the TMDLs, California has a TMDL on for dealing with trash in a number of the different watersheds. And one of the innovations that they've used is to require producer take-back for packaging as a way of re-internalizing those costs associated with trash and marine debris. And so that's another way, that's one of the institutional controls that they adopted through their TMDL program that I think is a pretty non-conventional approach to thinking about institutional controls, and maybe something that could be applied and experimented with in other areas of the country as well.
And I had a note for New York, as you're looking at using statistical methods to assess loading, be very careful and err on the high side, and then create a safety margin, because in the process of getting the numbers from DC Water's tunnel, that's only capturing 1/10 of the entire watershed. It's capturing as much trash as was expected to be coming from the entire watershed. So the estimates based on land use and then extrapolation in DC and Maryland were off by over a magnitude for the baseline of how much trash needed removing. And we've now seen that proven out in the numbers, advocates suggested that there were errors early on, but they weren't heeded, and now that's been proven out. So more than a magnitude off in those estimates.
All right, so we're going to close today with 4 final presentations. First, we're going to have Zach Huntington, the Executive Director of Clean Virginia Waterways, who's going to be speaking about how they're using voter surveys to inform public policy and education campaigns in Virginia. And that study ultimately inspired parts of the work that our next speaker, Steve Robbie of OpinionWorks, will be speaking about. He's going to be sharing some plans for a Mid-Atlantic-wide survey around behaviors and policy attitudes. And then next we will hear from Claudia Davis of Oceana, who will be speaking about her work with the business community to pass the often referenced during today and yesterday's New York City's Skip the Stuff bill. And then finally, we're going to close the session with Maryland State Senator Malcolm Augustine, who will present on efforts to pass the extended producer responsibility for packaging materials legislation in Maryland. And then, as usual, for the final time, we'll hold questions till the end after all 4 presentations have been given. Zach?
All right, thanks, Will. So I'm Zach Huntington. I'm the Director of Clean Virginia Waterways. We're a program of Longwood University. We're also the Virginia affiliate of the Ocean Conservancy. And our focus is on researching the sources and solutions to marine debris. Today we're going to talk about a public perception survey, how we're using it, how other groups can use it as well. So we'll do a little bit of background first. The Virginia Marine Debris Reduction Plan was first published in 2014, and we were actually the first state on the East Coast with the Marine Debris Reduction Plan. That plan was updated in 2021 to align with NOAA's Mid-Atlantic Plan, and this participatory and collaborative process involved marine debris stakeholders from across Virginia. It included state and local government, NGOs, academia, industry, private businesses, regional bodies, indigenous groups, and many others. It was so important to align these 2 plans because marine debris issues are so widespread, they can't always be solved with individual state approaches. Both of these plans emphasize the use of social marketing approach to change human behaviors, and they both emphasize the 4 main sources of marine debris. So the Virginia Marine Debris Reduction Plan has 4 goals. It's to understand, mitigate and prevent the impacts of consumer debris and single-use plastics, derelict fishing gear, microplastics and microfibers, and abandoned and derelict vessels. And these goals are broken down into 60 actions, which are discrete projects and activities that are taken to achieve the objective outlined in the goals. These 1 or multi-year step projects are necessary to complete the plan by the end. The Virginia Coastal Zone Management Program's marine debris funds are granted to us at Clean Virginia Waterways, and we work in close collaboration with CZM. So now the survey. One of the near-term actions of the Virginia Marine Debris Reduction Plan was to measure the public support for policies and laws that could reduce marine debris. And so this survey also gave us information on the policies that people would like to see going forward, what they're willing to do in terms of policy, the best language that we can use, and it was so important because it gave us insight from outside the environmental community. So the survey itself was a representative sample. There were 901 surveys in the data set, which gives us a good solid sample size and produces a margin of sampling error of about 3.3%. I left something out before that's very important to say. The survey was funded by a grant from the Virginia Coastal Zone Management Program and NOAA, and we worked with OpinionWorks and Steve to get the survey out there. And it's mixed mode sampling, which means that we use multiple modes of communication to reach out to folks. That included online and telephone, and yes, the telephone included landlines for the folks who still have those. We also had 10 in-depth interviews in May of 2022, and we'll get into those shortly. So this is what the sample looks like. It's an even representation of political affiliation and an accurate demographic breakdown of Virginia's population. Now, the high-level overview of what we learned was that there's broad bipartisan support in Virginia for proven policies that reduce plastic pollution. And I encourage you to take the time to read the entire 285 page report on our website. If you don't have time, we've broken it down into 8 pages as well. But that leaves a lot of information out. There's a whole lot in there. So identifying the target audience, right? In a broad sense, the target audience in this is registered voters in Virginia. But we want to break it down further because, right, we want the population demographics to reflect what we see in the state. And so that's why the multiple modes of sampling come in. So we mentioned multiple modes of sampling, and that's how OpinionWorks was able to pull together such a blended population sample that we see here. It's pulling in folks from all corners of the electorate, right? Diversifying how we're sampling folks, make sure there's an even representation of different ethnic, political, socioeconomic, and racial demographics in the survey. So identifying community concerns. And this is so important in the survey itself, right? So we can see here up at the top, plastic floating in the ocean and plastics and toxins in human food are the second and third highest concerns. And you can see we have a whole list of questions here, and they're not just about the environment, because we wanted to learn what Virginians' attitudes are towards plastics, towards plastic pollution, but we also wanted to see how it ranked in their overall list of concerns. And just in a general sense, voter surveys to identify community concerns are valuable tools to understand the needs, preferences, and priorities of that population. So we just saw this graphic, but we're going to talk about it some more. So identifying gaps in education and outreach. Voter surveys are a strategic approach to figure out these gaps as you're planning an outreach campaign. And so if you look here down at the bottom, the last one is trash and litter in your community, right? We see that 24% of people think this is a very serious problem, 36% of people think it's a somewhat serious problem. And so with that, we see just this huge disconnect, right? So we know that somewhere between 60 and 80% of all marine debris comes from land-based sources. And so, right, why are people concerned about it in the ocean but not their own backyard? With that knowledge, now we can change how we're speaking about the issue and really make sure we're really highlighting that it's coming from us here on land. So the 10 in-depth interviews that I mentioned before, we got some great information out of those as well. You can see the quote here at the top from Taylor. Of those 10 interviews, Taylor was the only person that had any idea that plastics came from chemicals, right? So now that we have this information, every presentation I give, everything I write has to include the statement that plastics are made with fossil fuels. They have a lasting negative impact on human environmental health for the entirety of their life cycle, starting with the extraction of natural gas and oil into transportation on trains and through pipelines, all the way down to their final resting place, whether it's in a landfill, a recycling center, or out in the environment. Voter surveys also are a great tool for assessing the best terminology we should use. So we ask people what they think when they hear the term marine debris. Most people thought of garbage or trash in the water. Some people thought of plastic or bags and bottles. And as a marine debris researcher, this was so important for me to hear. I can't be the only person who gets trapped in our bubble of just speaking to the same people, and we're all working on this, and it just becomes second nature to us. Right, so with that in mind, we wanted to know what we should be saying, right? So we asked people to tell us which of these terms seems more serious. And the outright winner was plastic ocean pollution, which is why you've heard me say that like 4 or 5 times already. We've had this survey was March of 2022, so we're coming up on a year, or almost 2 years since it's come out, and I'm still convincing myself to say plastic ocean pollution. So one of the other things that we can learn from voter surveys is participant willingness and identifying barriers. So we are a source reduction organization. We take the position that industry is largely responsible for the plastic pollution crisis. But we still need folks to do things like use reusable water bottles and reusable bags, and we need to understand what the barriers are that are stopping people from adopting those habits now. I can tell you that there are still barriers. I watched my neighbor get a grocery delivery the other day with 2 stacks of single-use plastic water bottles. I live in Roanoke County. We have awesome drinking water. So, identifying achievable goals. This survey has created a roadmap for organizations in Virginia as we look to implement proven policies to reduce marine debris. And identifying achievable goals in an outreach or advocacy campaign is so important because that's what organizations can use to make sure the campaign is staying on track. It allows them to stay on track. They're able to track progress and maintain the integrity of their campaign. So we have this list of policies that Virginians support, and with this knowledge, we have 2 broad questions that we're trying to answer right now. The first is, what are producers and distributors of frequently littered products spending to reduce plastic pollution in Virginia? And the second is, what is the economic impact of plastic pollution on Virginia? To answer the first part of that question, we completed an in-depth overview of litter taxes around the country. Virginia's litter tax is one of the funding mechanisms for the Virginia Litter Control and Recycling Fund. That's used for community cleanup programs, recycling initiatives, and other beneficial programs around Virginia, paid at the rate of $20 and $30 by producers and manufacturers of frequently littered products. And what we learned from this research is that Virginia's Litter Control and Recycling Fund generates the lowest revenue per capita of any state who's using these programs. And there are feasible means to improve the fund. To answer the next part of that question, it's a tall lift, so we're breaking it down into 2 phases. The first is a literature review of the economic impact of plastic pollution, and we're working with the George Mason University Center for Regional Analysis. They've got expertise in the topic. We should have that ready early next year. Phase 2 is the really exciting part. We're trying to figure out what the economic impact of plastic pollution is directly on Virginia. So we're trying to figure out what the financial burden that's faced by taxpayers, local government, and state government in terms of plastic pollution. So we're looking into things like, what are coastal localities spending to clean up their beaches, right? Virginia Beach uses beachcombers daily to remove mostly plastic trash from their beaches. What's the financial impact on work stoppages at MRFs? What are localities spending on cleaning up illegal dumping sites? What's the impact on Virginia's landfills as the use of single-use plastics continues to grow? That's obviously not an all-encompassing list. I'm sure there's folks in this room with ideas. If you have ideas, let us know and we'll start looking into it. We also have a report on container deposit laws and its potential impact here in Virginia, due to be published early next year. We also have a report on the impact of Virginia's local option bag tax. It'll be published early next year as well. Phase 2 of the economic impact should be ready next fall, hopefully. So identifying trusted messengers, this is super helpful. Several of the most successful plastic pollution reduction campaigns in Virginia have been so because they were supported by the Virginia Aquarium and VIMS. And if we look at this list of trusted sources of information, it's no surprise why that's happening. So the power of partnerships in utilizing these voter surveys and public outreach and advocacy campaigns, it really can't be overstated. Right? Differing groups bring a separate set of expertise and ideas to the table. So, a research organization partnered with a advocacy group, partnered with a local community group, all bring something unique to the situation that we're facing. Right? A research institution can provide reliable information and repeatable data. Advocacy groups have connected networks and established relationships with policymakers. Local civic groups have established relationships with the folks in their communities. And for successfully implementing these campaigns, it's going to take a diverse network of organizations and people to create a well-rounded approach. Thank you.
Good afternoon. That's a good microphone too. My name's Steve Robbie. I'm with OpinionWorks. I am grateful to Zach and Clean Virginia Waterways. I just think the work that they're doing and the strategic approach that you just heard about is amazing. It's very gratifying to me as a researcher to see our work put into action so smartly. That survey in Virginia has gotten a lot of mileage. And so what I'm going to try to do with my few minutes of presentation is give you a little look behind the curtain of that work to help you understand how you might employ these tools of survey research and qualitative work in both your policy advocacy and also in any behavior change work that you might be doing. My firm is OpinionWorks. We're based in Annapolis, Maryland. We poll for the Baltimore Sun newspaper, have done so since 2007. We work for advocates in Virginia, Maryland, and other states in this region. But we're also doing work nationally for recycling, for land conservation, for air quality, and other things, all of which is based upon this idea that we need to understand what our audience is thinking, feeling, and we need to tie to their hierarchy of needs. If we're going to make our issues relevant, we need to tie to that. And so this audience listening that I want to tell you about today for a few minutes helps us all do that. One of the things I'm proudest of that we have been a principal contributor and author of is the website ChesapeakeBehaviorChange.org, and you should bookmark that. Is anybody here involved with behavior change work, public outreach or behavior change? Is anybody engaged with that kind of work? That's great. So this website is owned by the Chesapeake Bay Program, which you may know is the consortium of federal and state agencies across the Chesapeake watershed, which works on many things. There are 10 broad goals in the watershed agreement for the Bay, and one of those 10 involves what's called stewardship, which is the people goal. It's about engaging people to do things. And so it's that people doing things part that is critical to their work and also to your work in marine debris, of course, because we want to stop these problems at the source and we want to get people engaged in restoration work and activity. So this website, preview, we just 2 nights ago made it live with the new 2023 data. There's a 6,500 person data set there that we've just populated. It's got amazing depth and power. You can drill down into local geographies and take a look at what people are doing across a suite of 21 different behaviors that impact water quality. So something to know about. But the other thing that's on there, the tab that says behavior change, if you go there, there's a primer on behavior change, 6 easy steps based upon the best practices, research, that we've distilled into a pretty easy tool that anybody who's not a social scientist could employ in your local community. So I encourage you to look at that tool. Now, this horrifying set of pictures, people putting balloons into the atmosphere, this is the previous work that I have helped Marco with, and some of you know that, but we have worked beginning in Virginia and then moving region-wide into looking at the causes of balloon release behavior and how we might replace that gratification with something else that is better and more healthy. And so PreventBalloonLitter.org is a website that's grown out of that work. Clean Virginia Waterways and Virginia CZM have been extremely influential in that work, and you should be familiar with it, but it embeds all these same principles of behavior change. From Zach's project that he was just telling you about, Monique, who's pictured here, is one of the 10 interviewees, one of those 10 in-depth interviews. And I just want to share a couple words that she said. It really kind of makes me sad that people won't take care of the earth and they'll just discard trash, not thinking anything about how it affects the ecosystem that we live in. It makes me wonder, why is this happening? Why hasn't anybody done something to help stop this or reduce this? I mean, look at Monique. She's vivacious and young and smart and hopeful, and yet really discouraged about the world that we're in. And it's important to hear these voices of people that are out there in the watershed or in our communities across these states so that we can engage them. So, preview of the upcoming work for MARCO is this. We're just about to put into the field a large regional baseline survey for MARCO, 2,000 interviews. It will be statistically significant in all 5 states in the region. It's going to address 2 things. One, it's going to take a look at policy preferences of the public, just like Zach's survey in Virginia did. On a range of measures that you've been hearing about this afternoon to understand where the public is on those so that we can provide some help and some information to those that are working on policy. I mean, it's also going to address some behaviors. And so there are 3 that are listed at the bottom of the screen. We'll be assessing behavior and motivation around disposable water bottles, derelict fishing gear, and smoking-related behavior, discarding cigarette butts and other debris from smoking activity. Then it'll be followed by qualitative interviews, which are deeper, like the 10 interviews that were done in the Virginia work, to really understand reasons why. So, 2 tools. You know, when you're thinking about research, audience research, the kind of work that I'm telling you about, there's 2 things to keep in mind. Tool number 1 is quantitative. And so that's like that 2,000 sample size survey that you might do across the region. It's used to diagnose, it's used to measure, it's used to figure out what's going on. What are people doing? What do they perceive? What do they believe? You know, scales and agree-disagree statements. And what policy options would they support? So favorability of favor and oppose of certain public policy responses. And then most importantly, I don't think it's most importantly, but very importantly, is the segmentation of the public so that you can understand where the engageable public is. What segments of the general public are really going to come forth who are poised to support these measures. The other tool is qualitative, and of course, you've all been involved in some way, I'm sure, in your life or career, maybe as a consumer, maybe as a sponsor of focus group work. And the focus group or in-depth interviews, individual or group interviews, are done to understand why questions. You know, we want to get people together into a comfortable environment where they're kind of with their tribe. There's no inhibitions. It's very an affirmative atmosphere. And we want to ask them, what's in the way? You know, if we're trying to get people to stop releasing helium balloons into the atmosphere, we want to understand why they're doing it and what's in the way of them stopping. And when we understand those barriers, then we can begin to put forward some tools and approaches that will change that behavior. How do we engage them? Why do they feel the way they do? It's so often, you can imagine being me, I think, you know, when you listen to these national studies like the president's approval rating or, you know, whether or not people support Obamacare or something, and the news organizations have these top-line numbers, and they're worried about things, and they'll say, why is it that 62% of the public feel a certain way? And it's this qualitative work that enables you to get underneath all of that and understand why the numbers are what they are. And oftentimes the public tells you contradictory things. And so to get to understand that, you've got to do this good qualitative work. Here's your dip into social science. I'll do this quickly and painlessly, you know, for those of you that are not social scientists. But this curve was invented, kind of, by Everett Rogers, who was a mid-20th century social scientist. It's called the diffusion of innovations curve. You might think of it as the bell curve. It's, you know, we think about it in terms of technology adoption. That's the most famous example. But you can also relate this curve to environmental behavior. So on the left side are people that are out there at Best Buy at midnight to get the next iPhone, you know, those innovators and early adopters. And then on the right side are the people who are still working with 8-track tape decks in their homes, the recalcitrant, resistant people. So this same thing is true with adoption of any environmental behavior you can think of. The same principle applies. And look where most people live, in the middle of that curve. Most of us are not at the leading edge or at the tail. Most people live in the middle, kind of a well-intentioned middle. So a social scientist in Washington State named Nancy Lee has come up with these 3 names for these 3 segments of this curve. On the left, the adopters, the early people, she calls them show-me's. Just show me what to do and I'll do it. We sometimes call them the choir. And then on the right-hand side are those recalcitrant folks, which she calls the make-me's. You're going to have to make me do it because I'm never going to. And then in the middle is everybody else. Help me. Just give me a little help. I want to, but it's hard. I don't have enough money. I'm too busy. I've got kids. I've got to get them to school. I can't do that thing, So they need a little push, a little nudge. Have you heard of the nudge theory? So that's what that is, that big bulge in the middle. So look at the blue curve. When it overlays on the yellow, the blue is our traditional response to this, which is that on the left side, we do all kinds of talking to the public. We have websites. We go out to community meetings. We have brochures. We have tables at events and all kinds of stuff. We're really good at doing that stuff. And guess who we get? We get the show-me people. And then on the other side of the scale, society invests enormous resources in what? Suing, regulating, legislating, doing all kinds of expensive and compulsory stuff to get those make-me people. Who does that leave out? All of that leaves out the help-me people in the middle who just need a little push. They just need a little shove. They need a little reminder or something like that, and they'll do the right thing. So this social science principle that's going to guide the Marco work is built on that understanding, that most people are well-intentioned, want to do the right thing, and they just need that little extra push or that help, that little bit of help. I talk about rain barrels in my work, and lots of well-intentioned organizations have rain barrel workshops, and they invite people to come over to their property and have a workshop on a Saturday, and people take their rain barrels home in the trunk of their car, and then guess what happens? They know how to hook up the rain barrel because they just learned, but 31% of those rain barrels that they take home in their cars never get connected to a downspout because people are afraid to cut off their downspout. They're not sure how to elevate it. They don't know if it's going to attract mosquitoes. And so you've got to give them a little extra help. It's not just the workshop. You've got to go to their house. You've got to actually get out your hacksaw, install it for them, show them how to use it. So that's what we're talking about here, if you want the rain barrel installed. So that same principle applies to all of the behaviors that you may be working on with regard to marine debris. Here's an example of how that works. So Clean Water Action, as you may know, has a canvassing operation. They knock door to door. They often get petition signatures. They raise money. And so they transitioned for a very brief time their operation in Capitol Heights, which is in suburban D.C. It's in Prince George's County, to trying to get people to extend their downspouts away from impervious or hard surfaces towards planted. And with the Prince George's County Stormwater Program, they had these free gutter extenders, downspout extenders, and they knocked and they got 50% of the people that they visited to sign this pledge that they would do it. And then they went back, and half of them actually did, with a little help from this canvasser, extend the downspout. Now, 24% in the end extended the downspout to planted away from impervious surfaces. Would that ever happen if you just went and spoke at a community meeting or put up something on your website? No. And so people need that little bit of help. Recycling, which is an area where I do a lot of work, you get an info card in the mail from your local recycling people, and that reminds you what to put in the bin and what not to put in the bin. In the city of Cincinnati on the right, where we've done some work, they discovered that if you just put a special receptacle in everybody's home for inside, that it increases recycling rates dramatically. It's really interesting, and I've been able to validate that nationally with quantitative work. So, following on some of the other discussion that you've heard about plastics, here's Carol from Williamsburg, who says, "It's very disturbing. I am concerned about plastic pollution in the water and elsewhere because it affects all the fish and wildlife and people. It's not good, and it's something that we really need to get a handle on because it's gotten to the critical point right now." plastic worry out there in the public is at an enormous height. In every focus group we do around anything, air quality, litter, whether it's around recycling, whether it's around reforestation, guess what comes up? Plastic floating around in the ocean. It's really incredible. It comes up all the time. People are very worried about it. They're worried about it getting into their food supply. These thoughts have penetrated the general public. What that means is that the public is motivated around this, and that translates into the support for the public policy issues that you've seen this afternoon. So I close on this. EPR, which you're going to hear about in a few minutes, there's big support for extended producer responsibility. And it's encouraging. And this question on Zach's survey asked people if they would favor or oppose requiring manufacturers to use less plastic in product packaging. And the numbers are enormous, as you can see, 76% in favor, 8% opposed. It's bipartisan, 82% of Democrats, 69% of Republicans. So plastic, 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 plastic. I mean, people are worried about it. You should know that all of the work that you're doing is strongly supported by the public. And so let's go. Let's go get them. That's all I have to say.
So my name is Claudia Davis. I'm here with Oceana to share the story of how we supported New York City's Skip the Stuff bill last year, almost exactly a year ago. And before I get into that story, I'm going to give a little bit of context about who Oceana is and sort of how we have arrived at our position as a plastic reduction policy. So Oceana is the largest international advocacy organization dedicated solely to ocean conservation. We have offices in 10 countries and the EU, and we're headquartered in just up the road in Washington, D.C., which is where I'm based out of. But on the state side, we have a really robust field team that operates in tons of coastal states across the country with plans to expand. And they're, really tirelessly fighting for state and local plastics victories on the ground, and they're also building lots of grassroots support for our federal policy priorities that also target plastic reduction. And obviously there are plenty of things that afflict the oceans that we're trying to tackle, and curbing pollution is one of our major ones. So we're here to talk about the plastics aspect of it. And I'm just gonna really quickly run through a couple of these items, because I think I'm really preaching to the choir here, but like one thing that we know for sure is just the extent of the problem, right? There's so much plastic out there that even an albatross who's spending most of its time airborne manages to fill its stomach with these materials. And as Zach really eloquently punted for me, plastic is a major contributor to the climate crisis, right? So at all stages of the life cycle, you're extracting fossil fuels, you're leaching greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and it's just like horrendous from a climate perspective. Then we know that plastic is also a social justice issue, right? So our refineries and even some of those disposal methods and waste management methods are disproportionately targeting already disempowered and marginalized communities. So tackling the issue from an upstream perspective is only going to benefit them in the long run. Then we don't really know much about biocompostables or bioplastics. I mean, we do know a lot, but there's still a lot to learn before we can, back it completely as a solution. So we're going to stay away from that one for a little bit before we know more. And then finally, recycling is just an incomplete solution, we know, because the rate of plastic production is just unchaseable. So even as we look to expand our recycling infrastructure and improve the technology that we have available to recycle plastics and other materials, the production is just going to skyrocket, and we'll never be able to catch it. So that leaves us to reduction, right? I think someone said this yesterday, but it's a phrase that we like to haul out over and over again at Oceana because it really tends to resonate. But when your bathtub is overflowing, you don't run for the mop, right? You want to turn off the faucet and then go get the mop. So we're really focused on upstream solutions, and Skip the Stuff is one of the ways that we do that. And thankfully, policies targeting reduction are getting really popular. So one of my favorite things about this graph is just how outdated it is. This is from a report in 2018 that only goes up to 2016 and shows a really lovely increase in international policies from like Africa to Asia to the States from 1990 to 2016. And you can see by 2016 there were loads, and that line has just continued to trend upwards since this report was published. So next time we present at the Marine Debris Summit, we'll have a much better graph for you to see that. So then I'm here to talk about one really specific way that Oceana approaches building grassroots support to build the political will to pass these plastic reduction policies. And the way that I do that in my work at Oceana is by managing something called the National Business Coalition for the Oceans. So we're inviting business owners on the coast or in ocean-related industries to get involved in our advocacy work because a clean ocean economy supports 3.3 million jobs and over $250 billion in GDP. So we want to protect the oceans as well as the livelihoods that are immediately dependent on that resource. And business owners know that, right? Like, they're not stupid. So this is a quote from Grant, who's one of our founding members of the Business Coalition. He's a realtor out on the West Coast. So he knows firsthand how important that healthy coastline is to the success of himself and his colleagues and the vitality of his community. And so you might be wondering, like, why does plastic pollution matter to business owners? What does it really have to do with them? Why should they care? And the sad truth is that a lot of the lies that we've been sold about plastic have trickled into the business sector, right? So they're really inclined to believe that it's clean, it's affordable, it's convenient, it's what customers want, it's durable, it's the only option we have. But of course, we all know that that is like a bold-faced lie, right? So in fact, plastic really presents a lot of barriers to coastal communities. It incurs a lot of costs to them that they don't really need to bear. And if we look at nationwide, an estimated $13 billion is lost by businesses such as fisheries, tourism, infrastructure operators, like recreator operators, each year just because of plastics. So the time and money that it takes to clean it up, to keep it out of the customer's view, to get it out of their gear, rounds up to about $13 billion every year. And when we've done location-based studies, which I'm happy to share with you after this, from like places like Orange County, California, all the way to southern Florida, we find that if we do the math, if we crunch the numbers and eliminate or greatly reduce the marine debris that's found and accumulated in those coastal places, there would be a huge bump in jobs and influx of dollars to that local economy. So it's just really expensive to manage, right? And ultimately, the less that an economy has to rely on plastics, the more that it has to rely on local chains of goods and services, right? So it's kind of a win-win for everybody. And there are a lot of businesses that are really leading the charge in this, right? So like your zero-waste grocery stores or like your durable takeout services, they're proving that it's possible. And so the next step is to have policies in place to make this the norm. And that norm is widely desired, right? So we heard some really great polling data earlier, and Oceana is a huge fan of that. So a poll we completed last year found that a huge majority of American voters are really excited and ready about policies that are targeting the reduction of single-use plastics. So not just business owners, not just the tell-me's, but everybody, right? All the customers and general public. So now we get to the fun part, which is the story of how do we take that information about the impact of plastic on the business community, about the urgent need for plastic reduction, and how we put that all into action to actually make it happen. So I was really excited to be brought on board for New York City's Skip the Stuff campaign last year through the National Business Coalition for the Oceans, but this was a campaign that they had been really chipping away at for years before I even stepped on the scene. It had been introduced in the New York City Council, I think twice, before it was introduced again as INT 559 in early 2022. So this was its third iteration, and it had just met like all kinds of random barriers, as I'm sure many of you know, getting into council and not making it to the hearing or getting too amended or whatever happens. It's December, and we want to go on holiday early, that kind of stuff. So I think it was kind of explained pretty well earlier this morning. I don't know how much of a refresher we all need on Skip the Stuff, but it's a really common sense style of plastic reduction policy, right? So those like little packets of forks and napkins and salt and pepper that you might get in a takeout order, or ketchup packets that you don't necessarily need because you're ordering into home and you have mustard in the fridge and you have forks in the drawer. This would, just add a simple check and balance to that influx of plastic and let people only get that if they really need it. Check the box saying, yes, I do want that included in my bag. And for that reason, it makes it a really low effort, high reward policy solution. So there's no swap or startup costs that the business has to incur because they're like replacing all of their plastic forks with durable ones. And overall, they're spending less on replacing those utensils because they don't have to provide them to every single customer anymore. They're putting in a good faith effort, to reduce plastic pollution. That's really exciting for their customer base and tends to drum up support for their business. And then, the benefits to community are really apparent as well. So there's just less waste to manage overall, obviously lower pollution in ocean-bound plastic, which then, as we know, will increase the vitality of that local tourism economy. And one of the most exciting things I think about a skip the stuff policy is that it's a really great on-ramp to sort of more aggressive, let's say, plastic reduction policies. So once you've kind of like dipped your toes into the pool of like, I guess we didn't really need all those forks, then you can kind of look at some bigger fish to fry. And especially in states where we see preemptions or bans on bans, as was explained in the earlier session, skip the stuff can be a really great way to sort of like skirt those preemptions while advocates work on repealing them and still diverting waste in the process. And it has enormous precedent. So thanks to organizations like Upstream Solutions and Beyond Plastics, they're still out there. I'm happy to share them with you, but they created some really accessible and comprehensive toolkits to help get the word out about this style of policy and how to make it happen in your community. And especially during the pandemic when takeout was at an all-time high and people were staying at home to eat that takeout and watching the plastic accumulate in their drawer. It really, really took off. And so we saw skip the stuff policies succeed in several major cities across the country, in DC, in Denver, in Chicago, LA and San Diego were such big grabs, and then lots of other municipalities across the coast of California that the entire state of California passed a skip the stuff policy last year. And then Washington State has done that too because they're Washington State. But at this point last year, New York City was still kind of like the last big urban center that had yet to do such a move. But New Yorkers were antsy, right? Like they were ready for that kind of change. So a statewide poll that we did, similar to that nationwide poll of New York voters, found that an even greater majority than Americans as a whole were ready for those state and local policies to reduce plastic pollution. And so that's nearly 9 in 10 New York voters are wanting that. And I'm sure many of us are familiar with just how untenable the waste problem in New York City has become in recent years. So diverting some of that waste or just eliminating it altogether was really, really exciting for everybody. And there were already several businesses paving the way, as they are often want to do. So the photo in the bottom right is from Deliver Zero, which is a company that offers durable and reusable takeout containers to businesses that sign up. So like the stage was really set, right? Like everybody was raring to go. So we had the bill. We had a hearing scheduled, so now we had to stack the bench. We had to make sure that we had as much positive testimony in favor of the bill as possible. So that's when I came in with the National Business Coalition and worked with the Reusable NYC Coalition to really like comb through our contacts and our Rolodexes and think of who would be the most upstanding advocates in favor of this bill that could really sway the council and make sure that it actually made it out of the hearing this time. So we relied on a lot of existing relationships, right? This was a really tight turnaround, so I can't reiterate like how impossible this would have been if we were starting from zero and had to do a bunch of cold outreach, and I'm happy to answer questions about that after. But all in all, we managed to get 12 individual business owners to provide written or spoken testimony at the hearing. Many of them joined the rally outside on the steps of City Hall, which is photographed there, which it was like the most uninviting 9 a.m. Tuesday in December. But they were out there with their signs, And then they went inside to join what ultimately ended up being almost 3 hours of testimony in favor of the bill from a really broad variety of stakeholders. And businesses themselves really ran the gamut from zero waste grocery stores that knew the process inside and out, knew the issue, to cafes that hadn't adopted something like this yet and were excited to see it happen, to dive shops that operate out of the Rockaways and couldn't complete a dive without hauling pounds and pounds of trash out of the water and wanted to just stop letting that plastic enter the water so that they could enjoy their dive, right? And ultimately that worked. So the bill passed with flying colors almost unanimously from the New York City Council and was eventually signed into law by Mayor Adams in February of this year, which was super exciting. And it just went into effect at the end of July of 2023. So it's only been real and on the ground for a few months, so still a lot of progress to make. But there's some really great resources out there from the Department of Sanitation. They've been doing a lot of really great work on outreach and communication and door knocking for restaurants to make sure that they know that this is happening and that in a year from July, they will start incurring fines if they're found to be non-compliant. They're still working on an effective way for customers to report that non-compliance. So if you have any ideas, let me know. But overall, I think it's a really, really exciting start, especially compared to what I anecdotally have seen in DC, where we also have had Skip the Stuff for a few years. But if you're curious to see more about how the city of New York has decided to kind of tackle this outreach and what materials they're pushing out, nyc.gov/skipthestuff has a lot of really, really great stuff. And so, again, just to reiterate, it was a really diverse group of stakeholders. The business community was just one facet advocating for this plastic reduction bill, but I just want to drive home the power of the concept of a healthy ocean economy, that there are people's livelihoods on the line, there's health of the ocean on the line, and that it's really a win-win. If we can do everything we can to protect our marine resources, then we can continue to enjoy them, we can continue to borrow from them responsibly in perpetuity. So I encourage you to scan either one of the QR codes. Please scan both. Check out the National Business Coalition for the Oceans, and please reach out to me with any questions about that. And please check out Reusable NYC. They're still doing lots of great plastic reduction work, even after that huge victory. So they deserve all the attention they can get. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Malcolm Augustine, a state senator from Maryland. How many Marylanders do we have in here? Got quite a few. All right. Let's go Terps. So I'm here to talk about, obviously, the producer responsibility legislation that we worked on in Maryland. But first, I want to just start by thanking the MARCO Mid-Atlantic and this Mid-Atlantic Marine Debris Work Group for inviting me to speak about the work that we've done in the Maryland General Assembly and the legislative process with members to pass that producer responsibility law. And we've changed the way that we talk about it. We don't talk about it as EPR and extended producer responsibility. We just talk about it as just producer responsibility. Particular legislation we worked on around the packaged goods. So that's the stuff that we worked on. But before I talk a little bit about that, I do want to also just say, as a legislator, I will just share with you all are part of the advocate community. There are certain things that you just should not do when you're talking to legislators. One is do not talk in acronyms, because we don't know what you're talking about. And we'll start with that. And that's important. I'm just being really serious right now. There's no way to turn somebody off more than, you're talking down to them, or, and it's just sort of you're not really communicating, or you're smart. I get that. You guys are smart, right? But it's just, that can really, you can really kind of create some things that could sink you kind of right away, just being very honest with you. The other thing is, the issue is important. There's just no question about that. But I was sent there by 150,000 people who are worried about crime. They're worried about putting food on the table, paying the rent. And that's what they talk to me about, more often than not. So marine debris is important. There's just no question about it. But know that these things are also, it's a part of a larger sort of conversation that we have as legislators for the people who we are responsible to and the things that they care about. And everything is kind of on a spectrum, too. So while it is true that you could have a poll that would show that people don't, they don't want there to be marine debris, there's no question about that. But the question is, how important is that to them versus some of the other things that are going on in their life that they really are worried about and that they're looking to us to really do something about? So to me, it's just important to sort of set the frame of where the work that we have to do in the legislature at the beginning of what I share with you today. It's a team sport also. What we do is a team sport. And in this team sport, I've had partners. I'm in the Senate, and then we have the House of Delegates. And our current comptroller, we got Marylanders here, so I know you all voted for Brooke Learman because she's statewide, our comptroller. Well, she was my partner in the House originally when she was in the House of Delegates, and she would work on these things. And now Delegate Sarah Love has been my real partner as well in this work. And the way I think about this work that we do, I think about it as a series of gates that you've got to go through when you're trying to pass legislation in Maryland, for sure. And in Maryland, it's 10 gates, basically, that you got to go through. That's right, 10 gates in order to get for a policy legislation to be passed. And the first, and get that codified into law. The first gate is appropriately framing the problem and solutions you want to bring to the legislature's attention. Now, I would just ask you all, how many of you have pitched an idea to a legislator along those lines? You guys have? I haven't seen you. Yeah, I've seen you. Yeah. What state?
New Jersey.
Oh, okay. All right, yeah. So I know my Maryland folks, they come out to Annapolis. So that's an important thing to do, is to go out there and pitch the idea, because you talk to the folks, they'll get a better sense of knowing sort of like what it is. After you've done that, you've pitched that idea, you got to remember that, like I was saying earlier, we have like one overarching goal that we have, and that's we're trying to make sure that we take care of the quality of life for Marylanders. Things like goodwill, they're important. There's just no question about it, but you really do have to sort of bring them back to the things that people care about. There was discussion about the balloons, for example. Now, it took a couple years for us to pass legislation that would create penalties for the release of balloons. Part of that was, again, it's the same thing. You talk about it, folks, you hear about it as a marine debris issue, but in the neighborhood, people release balloons on birthdays. People release balloons when someone was shot. And that was things that people were not happy to have us in the legislature say that, the conversations on the floor of the Senate were, now you're going to make it illegal for a kid to release a balloon. Now, that's not actually what the law does, or anything, but that's what's said. And that's the kind of thing that we hear when we are dealing with certain policies that are out there that you just don't necessarily know the impact that they may or may not have, or how they might be presented. So at the outset, it's always just important that you lobby us in a way that communicates clearly, that we can really understand what you're saying, and that you are thinking about some of the other things that are going on with that. And so now that you've presented this side to a legislator, and I say, oh my gosh, yeah, that sounds like a good idea, right? You've made it through the first gate, right? That's through the first gate that I've agreed, because that's the way it's set up. You got to get a legislator to be the sponsor of your piece of legislation. Then you can get to through that second gate, once you've done that, which is when they take ownership of it. You got to make sure that the person who you're working with really owns that piece of legislation that that's being proposed, and make sure that when it is pitched, it's like really concise, it's really tight, and that the member who's sponsoring it has identified someone who sits on that committee too is important. So the way that we're structured in Maryland is we are structured with four standing committees, basically. And this is where the who sort of matters. So you may say, oh, Malcolm, yeah, I want you to sponsor this piece of legislation that has to do with criminal justice reform, right? Because it's an issue, it's an important issue in Maryland right now. But I don't sit on that committee. It's not where I sit. We have 4 standing committees. First one is budget and tax. The second one is judicial proceedings. The third one's finance, which is really kind of a misnomer in that it really is the health, business, and insurance committee. And then there's another committee, education, energy, and the environment, which is where I do sit. So that would be where some of these kinds of pieces of legislation would really, really make a lot of sense for you to get that to a person who sits on the committee of jurisdiction. The third gate is that you have to demonstrate that the proposed associated costs are justifiable. So again, as I said before, it's like we got a lot of these really strong policy initiatives, but you still got to make sure that it works from a financial standpoint. And you will have the differing sort of stakeholders who will make presentations that will determine whether or not, will make their pitch about whether or not this is something that makes sense or not. There is a technical document that we have that's called a fiscal note, which puts together, it says, okay, what does this policy do? What's the past policy been? What is this going to cost? What's it going to mean to the state? And that technical document is influenced by folks. So they might come to you all as subject matter experts and say, share with us how these things might work. Well, that matters because we look at that document, particularly when we get to that fourth gate, which is when we get to the public hearing, okay? Because the legislators will be looking at that document. They'll say, okay, what does this thing really do? And why does it do what it does? They'll use that as kind of a cheat sheet for what's going on. When we get to that fourth gate, which is the public hearing, when the proposal is no longer a confidential piece. So how many of you all have testified at a public hearing for a piece of legislation? 1, 2, 3, you've fallen off, all right? You've testified. Very powerful, right? Y'all are the people who care the most about this. Listen, you got to come out there and make your presentation if it's something that you care about. You got to come out there and show. You got to come out and say why this is important, why I can sponsor it. But I sponsored 25 bills this last session, 25. And of those 25 bills, I did behavioral health, health occupations, business regulation, environmental, energy policy. Like, one of those bills was producer responsibility. So I need the help of the folks who are really sort of experts in the space in order to really help move to have a successful public hearing, which is, if we get that successful public hearing, we get through that fourth gate. And so then we got to move on to the fifth. And that fifth gate is whether or not the chair of that committee is going to decide whether or not they're going to let that thing get to a vote. And that is just this, there's certain discretion. The chair may or may not like it. You got to figure out, we have committees of 11. And so you got to get to 6 votes in order to get something out. And remember, we're all just people. I just want you to make sure you remember that. So the people in my committee are not scientists, they're not environmental scientists, they're just not. I mean, in my committee, we got a lawyer, a professor, engineer, accountant, an IT exec, a couple feds, and a couple small business people. And they're just regular, they're just folks. So we need to understand the concept in a way that is understandable for us. And you got to get them to support your legislation and get you to a vote. Because that's what, you have to convince them in a way that they can understand, and the concept that's understandable in order for you to get through the gate of getting out of the committee with a vote. Which then moves you on to the next gate, which is when you get into the chamber itself, if you've been able to manage your way out of the committee system. And now you're on the floor, and it's the exact same thing. You got to be ready to fight for it on the floor of the Senate. And in the Senate, we had to get to 24 votes in order to get across to the other chamber. And sometimes, though, it can be tricky. Like, I had a single-use plastics bill for a couple of years, and I was told, it doesn't have enough votes. You don't have enough votes and everything else in order to do it. I said, okay. So I got 24 co-sponsors for the bill. So I was like, well, I got 24 co-sponsors, we should be okay. Managed to get it out to the Senate floor, but somehow it didn't move because there's still some gates. In that instance, it was a committee chair who really just didn't like single-use plastics, and I just couldn't convince her that it was a policy that was good for the state of Maryland. And so that's how, even if you are able to kind of get through those things, you just never know sort of like what might stop you. But in this instance, if we get through that and we get a vote and we get 24 votes, we get across to the other side, and you got to do it all over again, unfortunately. Because that's the way it works. You got to go all the way to the other side, and on the other side, you got to go through the whole thing all over again, and it has to pass in the exact same form. Now, my thing is that what I've had to do in that way is I have to be willing to compromise without losing the full legislative intent. That's the whole point to me, in the policy. Because that's the only way you could kind of like make your way through. And that's what we tried to do with the producer responsibility bill that we were able to get through this last session, although it actually took 2 years. So the first year we had it, we introduced it. That's when Comptroller Learman and I worked on. She put in tremendous work to get a really good bill, very, very good bill. We just could not get it moved. In that instance, there were beverage industry just didn't like the bill. I mean, just telling the truth. Like, they didn't. And they just threw all kinds of stuff at my colleagues, like I was sharing with you. Like, they're not, it's not overly complicated, but folks can make it complicated for you, right? And so they made it complicated, made it such that it really, it failed, unfortunately. But in the second year, what we try to do is say, okay, fine, we understand that you don't like this bill, but we have worked with all of the stakeholders to try to answer as many questions of them that they can without losing the quality of the main components of the piece of legislation, and to move it through the process. And we were able to do that. We got it out of the Senate. In the first year, it was in the Finance Committee, because that's where I was on. So it's also like where it goes. I got away from the committee chair that I was sharing with you that didn't like the bill. We moved it to another committee. There's lots of different moving parts in this whole sort of like legislative process. We moved it to the committee where I was sitting, and we were able to get it out. We got it over to the House, where again, it was just more of there were challenges in the House, but we had to again make compromises. So we pared this bill back to what we ended up with, which still moved things forward, but it wasn't what we started with. We started with a complete extended producer responsibility system that we were going to put into place. We had worked hard to do that. What we came back to was a statewide needs assessment that would lead to it, that would create a producer responsibility organization, and would really pretty much set us up for us to be ready to make this producer responsibility, extended producer responsibility program in 2025. So it really backed us up by a year, but it was the compromise that we had to make in order to be successful. That is the process that we have to go through for every single bill, and I'm just grateful to get a chance to talk to you guys about it today. Thank you.
My question is actually for Steve. I might be one of the only social science nerds in the audience, so I apologize if this is really hyper-specific. But you did reference CBSM like on the slides, though you didn't necessarily get into some of that. I was curious, it's sort of a two-part question. Do you think there's value in educators, researchers, whatnot, learning a little bit more about like the model behind community-based social marketing and things like that? And if so, are there resources that can be shared out? Because I know there are like trainings or things like that people can go to, but obviously there's barriers and costs and things like that. Do you have any resources for organizations who maybe want to learn a little bit more about the science behind those tools as opposed to just the results from the surveys?
Yes, what a great question. So community-based social marketing is the model that I was showing you. I just didn't name it that way, but that is the commonly held model. So what I was saying about the ChesapeakeBehaviorChange.org website is that under that behavior change tab, there is a primer there which has some linked resources. So that's one place that people can go. It's free, and it's accessible. And there's some worksheets, there's some articles to read, there's some good basic stuff. You can go to a training. I mean, some of you have heard of Doug Mackenzie Moore, who's based, I think, at the University of British Columbia, and he's got a global footprint, and he does trainings that maybe some of you have attended. He travels the world and does that. And there's others who do that kind of training. You can read his books that are very accessible, but there's a whole community of these behavior change nerds, you know. We just happen to be in a place, given the tremendous amount of energy that is going into the Chesapeake Bay restoration effort, and the fact that two of the leading funders, particularly the Chesapeake Bay Trust, but also the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, which is EPA's granting arm, have both adopted this behavior change model and are pursuing it with their grantees. And so there's a whole bunch of people that are learning about this, and so it's easy to sort of tap into that network and get mentoring. So feel free to reach out. Anybody who's interested in this, you can reach out to me if you want. There's other people that know about this. Some of the people sitting around here know about it, but don't hesitate. Steve@opinionworks.org. I mean, just send me a note if you want to get plugged in.
My question is for Senator Augustine. I do not envy your work. The amount of topics you have to balance, all the concerns that everyone has this day and age, like, I commend you for everything you do and your level of patience for the work. And I have been to Annapolis on multiple occasions. I've popped in on several committee hearings. And through that process, we are very fortunate as Marylanders to know that a majority of our representatives do care about the environment and have passed several wonderful bills, especially the past several years. That being said, when I do pop in on those committee hearings, it is a little discouraging sometimes to see some of these like more simple plastic solution efforts not being practiced by our elected officials. Are there any internal conversations around making our efforts more sustainable on the Hill?
Yeah, that is discussed. I mean, there's no doubt about that. So the answer is yes. And my seatmate would complain about me if I did it too, because she was far more cognizant of being of sustainable practices that we are practicing what we preach. So we do have those conversations for sure. But then a lot of our colleagues are like, yeah, but I answer to the people back home. Like, don't tell me what to do. I'm just telling you, like, that's a part of it.
Along those same lines, my first interest was politics, and I followed that process along as well. And often when you're talking to an area of interest voters who want something very specific, then they watch the process of the sausage get made, they lose all hope and pride in what they're doing because it's not what they originally wanted. They then turn against that organization, that project, saying that's why we can't trust them, vote them all out, get more and more radical in their ideology. What do you do to try either stop them in that march or push them in a different direction to take that energy somewhere else and more useful?
Well, I mean, I get yelled at all the time, number one, so that's okay. I signed up for it. I signed up for it again. I do try my very best to, in quiet places, talk to people about the best way to reach your goal, but then also just to explain that it is a compromise. I mean, that's an effective, you can't get things passed unless you're willing to compromise. There are some folks who could be heroes because they don't compromise, but then they actually aren't able to move the needle. And so if the thing is for people to know, there's a few different things I would say. People should also understand that just because it's your number one priority, it's not everybody's number one priority. And people have different points of view. They have different lenses and the ways that they look at things. And that, to me, if you can kind of step back for a little bit and appreciate that, listen. Avalon and I were talking about that earlier. She was asking me, what do I think is like the most effective part of being a legislator? I think it's listening. So you listen, and then you try your best to find the best in the middle. And so I would suggest that people try to do that and celebrate wins. People like winning. celebrate some wins, and then hopefully they'll add on to each other.
This might be a question for a different day and a different meeting, but I was thinking a lot about the ocean being downstream of everything, and walking into this room, having not really studied much about marine debris in my career, but sort of coming with this idea in my head that source reduction is really important, and the ocean is downstream of everything. And I love the metaphor of the mop, and let's turn off the faucet. And I'm Googling a little bit, and I see there's an EPA, a draft EPA national strategy on how to address plastics pollution. I know several of us in the room, Marco and Oceana and Ocean Conservancy, and others have submitted comments on that. I'm just curious, like, what do people think? Is that important? Is it going to be part of a solution? Is it going to potentially lead to changes with this action in this administration or a future one, or with the Congress? And in that DC policy, Stu, it seems like the spherical look at things. It'd be good to just understand what's going on in that space.
Overall, I think the draft national strategy is a good thing. Being that it's still a draft, there's still changes that are going to be happening. And there are two converging thoughts on the plastic pollution problem, and there's competition going towards the draft national strategy. Industry has taken a viewpoint that we can recycle our way out of this problem, and they have taken they've taken processes like plastics to fossil fuel production, and they're trying to include that in the definition of recycling. The other thought, as you mentioned, is source reduction, and there is a federal bill that is guiding some of the thought process in the draft national strategy of the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. And my opinion is that legislation would do a great deal to reduce the plastic pollution crisis. Things like a 3-year moratorium on new plastic production facilities, a national bottle bill, national bag fee, things like that. So as the strategy is developed, we've submitted comments as well, asking for a focus on source reduction and verifiable proven policies that have already been implemented on state and local levels, and as well as around the world, to take the lessons that we've collectively learned and implement those here.
Well, thank you for a very, very good 2 sessions on policy. I just hope that the planning maybe would move these policy sessions to earlier in the program so that we can think of solutions the next time we meet as a group. Thank you.
Noted.